to take 5 minutes and 1 second.
Yeah.
I'll finish one before.
No. You take.
Yeah. No, I have to finish in time.
Yes. So it's 4 o'clock. Should we begin?
Yeah, up to you.
Yeah, we can, I think. Ravi, can you just put your video off and mute yourself?
Yeah.
And I'll request other panelists to just mute yourself. And only probably Janak can show his video and unmute and talk. Hello? Janak?
Janak actually unmuted himself. He muted
Janak?
himself.
Janak, you can start.
Oh, okay.
Hello. Janak.
Hello, can we start now? Neha?
Yes, Janak, please start.
Yeah, okay. Good afternoon, friends. We are now into the third webinar, and it's in the webinar series on floods. And we have had 2 webinars so far, and this is the third one. And the first one was on the demystifying floods, and the second one was on flood experience across India, learning from the grassroots level experience. Actually, in the last 2 webinars, we have learned a lot, and quite a lot of critical questions and critical observations have been made. And particularly, we had very eminent speakers with us on the first day, and on the first webinar. We had speakers like Dinesh Mishra ji, Uma Maheshwari, Ravi Chopra ji, Siddhartha Agarwal, and Manoj Mishra, who made extremely critical and very important observations. There is the very basic issue, like, how do you understand flood? What is flood? And how do you negotiate the flood? And who decides? And who decides it is flood, and how scientific the understanding is? These are extremely very important observations, and also they raised a very important issue on what is the kind of a documentation we have on the flood, and what is our knowledge on flood. Therefore, it is actually taking us to the very fundamental questions, and these fundamental questions are extremely important for us to find solutions. In fact, these speakers talk about how exactly we arrive at the solutions and who arrive at the solutions, how relevant these solutions are for the flood situations. This is something which we raised, and very often they said the structural solutions to floods, such as embankments, are all just a kind of joke, doesn't help. And therefore, they raised a very important issue of, we have quite a lot of myths about the floods. Therefore, it is important for us to demystify the flood. And for that, it is important the riverine ecosystem, river flow, and the lake river, and also, most importantly, earlier we have said the floods will come and go, the floods are not receding. So the next issue particularly was saying, why is it going? What are the issues? What are the concerns? And the issue, that's what become a huge event, and why? So these again, rivers also change their courses, and whether these rivers are changed because of naturally or because of any kind of anthropogenic reasons. Also, an important issue raised during the first day, it was to what extent interlinking of rivers can really influence the flood. So these are very important issues we have had, and in fact, Uma Maheshwari was also raising a very important issue. Rivers as distant, constructed, and controlled, and sacred space. Rivers as a distant, constructed, and controlled, and the sacred space. You call it a sacred space as a river, but then you also exercise your control over it. And this is something which is very important. We need to demystify. Ravi Mishra was making very important observations, particularly talking about Himalayan rivers, and where the rivers originate at the peak of 8,000 meters. The most important observations he made was the erosions that it is taking place. While erosion, it also carries a lot of sediments. These sediments and minerals are really purified, have the capacity to purify the river. Indirectly was also saying, don't spend thousands of crores of rupees in the cleaning of the Ganges, but just leave it alone. If you leave it alone, rivers can clean themselves. In the process, he was also saying, by constructing huge dams, you are only aggravating the flood. And also, while understanding the river, one of the most important issues that was talked about was, understand the health of the rivers. How do you understand the health of the rivers? What are the parameters? How do you really document? How do you really go about finding solutions? These are issues that we have discussed, and then we have had experiences at the grassroots level, learning about what the floods are about, particularly from Assam, and then we had experiences from Bihar, Orissa, and Kashmir. And in the process, we also learned quite a lot about the Kerala floods. I mean, each the characteristics about the flood. These distinct characteristics have got also lots of hydrological, socio-economic, and also hydrogeologic reasons for the flow of floods. And you really understand that you will not be floods are. And that is the reason why we are going to discuss all of floods. Why we say that floods are homogeneous? Why floods is not a homogeneous category? What are the factors? Are the hydrogeological? Is there geological? What are the issues? What are the factors? Understand. That is precisely what we are going to discuss today.
I think we have lost the connection with Jana.
Abraham, I request you to please take it forward.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I'm audible.
Yes, Abraham,
Okay.
you can begin.
Okay. Yes. Once again, I welcome all of you to this webinar, which is being organized by the Water Conflict Forum. This is part of the series of 5 webinars, and we are in the 3rd one. And today's topic is a very, very important question: are all the floods same? Our objective was to kind of create a kind of knowledge and experiences around floods, which is happening around the country, to understand its sociology, the economics involved in it, the history, the myths, and above all, the phenomenology of experiences of various people who are being affected by the floods. And I don't want to spend too much time on giving an introduction, which Dr. Janak has already done. We have, for today's webinar, we have 4 speakers with us with diverse and deep experiences of working with flood, with rivers, with environmental issues on a wider scale. We have tried to get experiences from different parts of the country, and as a continuation of the 2nd webinar, which was basically on the first-hand experiences from the people who are being impacted by webinar by the flood. This time we are going to look into the scientific or the abstractions of what is these experiences around the country. And our first speaker for this is Parthadas, Dr. Parthadas. He is based at Guwahati. He is an environmental researcher, a policy advocate, a kind of practitioner who has wide experiences in working on the northeast part of the country. His experiences ranges from understanding climate variability, climate change adaptation, climate and water-induced risk management, water governance, water conflicts, environmental impacts of larger dams on Northeast India, etc. And he is at present the head of Water, Climate and Hazard Program in Aranyak based at Guwahati. I invite Partho. And before that, I have a small announcement to the participants. There is a question and answer icon, and those who want to raise questions to the participants, they can please type their questions there very clearly. And there is also a chat box. And if you have some specific discussion, then you can put your comments and your observations in the chat box. But please make it a point that your questions, the questions the participants comes in the question. Invite Partha and and I request them to abide by the time so that we have some time left for discussion and participation. So all the participants who
Can
have
you see my presentation?
attending this program.
Thank you, Abram. Thank you. Can you see the presentation?
Yes,
Sarita?
Partha, we can see. You
Okay.
can just put it on the slide mode and start your presentation. Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In conforming to today's theme of discussion, I mean, the question we are asking ourselves, are all flats same? And I'm going to, argue that all flats are not same, depending on various the unique geographical characteristics and different.
Partha, you are not audible at all.
I'm not audible. How come?
No, Partha, we can hear you. We can hear you.
Others are hearing me. Anyway.
Yeah, please continue.
Anyway, depending on different geophysical, geohydrological, ecohydrological characteristics of a particular region, floods can be produced in very different ways. And this first picture that I'm showing you gives you an idea of, and you are familiar, I know, by seeing it in videos and internet and TV, that this is the typical flood situation.
There is some problem.
When the entire valley and the floodplain in Assam is underwater. This is a typical picture from the Kaziranga floodplain. And the very next picture gives you a very different kind of perception where you see, floods in the foothills and a lot of mudslide coming with floods. So these two pictures give you the ideas to distinguish between two broad typologies of floods, which we call the normal riverine floods, which are actually the overwhelming floods, which are a slow onset event, can be monitored, can be managed relatively easily. But on the other hand, you have a lot of flash floods happening in the eastern Himalayan region, the northeast and Assam, which are actually very first onset events, which are very short life cycle, can range from a few hours to at most a day or two, can cause heavy devastation within a short span of time, and it's very difficult to monitor and predict and manage. So from these two broad classification, we have actually recognized for Eastern India 7 different mechanisms through which floods are triggered. Maybe in the mountains, maybe in the valleys, maybe in the floodplain itself. And these are different kind of triggering mechanisms. It's not possible to explain everything within 10 minutes. So I will try to explain the situation by taking a few examples. For example, take this case of very, very famous Yogong flash flood that devastated part of Arunachal Pradesh in East Siang district and part of Dhemaji district in Assam. But these floods were not triggered here. Floods were triggered far away, almost about 200 kilometers away in Tibet, in a tributary of the Brahmaputra, which is called Yalnung Jangbo. And because of the landslide which formed there, and then a consequent collapse of that landslide, a lot of water came down, producing flood havoc in far downstream areas. So this is quite common. Another example that is also very well known is what happened in Bhutan in 2004, a similar way, what we call landslide dam outburst flooding, which some people also call landslide lake outburst flooding, which was referred to and explained by Ravi Chupraji in the first webinar, is exemplified time and again in Northeast India. Every year it happens in here, in this or the other place. So in this typical example, this landslide in 2004 in Satichu River of Bhutan caused a heavy, the avalanche of a heavy flood downstream, which hit the gates of the Kurichu Dam, and then which then created unprecedented flood havoc in Western Assam. So this is a very strong typology as far as floods are concerned. And then you have the ubiquitous embankments. Assam has about 5,000 long embankments, the longest in the country, but most of them are not well maintained, timely, and in terms of quality. And that's why most of the embankments are vulnerable and very, very prone to developing breaches. And whenever there is a breach in an embankment, there is a catastrophic flood. This is quite different from a normal flood that would have been produced in the absence of the embankment. Therefore, this is also another class of flooding, which is very important to understand. And I'm talking about these very different types of triggering mechanism and causes and consequences of flooding, because it is very important to understand and distinguish among the different types of flooding, because only then we can take appropriate mitigative measures and strategies and can make a difference to people's suffering. So there is another situation which is I'm sure also common in many urban areas, but I'm basically talking about even rural areas in Assam. There is a lot of flooding which is actually not riverine flooding. You have vast areas inundated because of waterlogging and drainage congestions. And this is mostly produced by linear structures which perpendicularly obstruct waterways. For example, embankments, for example, railway lines, roads, and other structures. In 2010, I did an estimate and study, and it shows that between 1954 and 1980, most of the embankments were built in Assam, whereas at the same time, ideally, it was the government was supposed to develop a similar and proportionately strong drainage network, but it was never done. So on one hand, we kept on adding embankment after embankment. On the other hand, we didn't do anything about our drainage facilitator, drainage structures. And this is a fundamental reason why there is more frequent flooding and more frequent or more damage, at least in the valley of the state. And this is this particular incident, which we call GLOF or glacial lake outburst flood, is not very common, but there are examples of our rivers of Assam and North Bengal and Bangladesh being affected by GLOFs, which have happened in the past in Bhutan and also in Sikkim, in the Tista Basin. In Bhutan, for example, this picture shows you there are a lot of potentially dangerous glacial lakes which are waiting to burst. And many of these lakes which have formed because of recession of glaciers and also because of climate change and global warming are connected to some very important rivers like Manas, the Sonkos, the I, etc. So these are also impacting our rivers and contributing to flooding. So now very recently, Assam has started almost regularly experiencing kind of artificial flooding because of unwarranted and unwarned release of water from dams. For example, regularly, there are 4 or 5 different dams which are regularly flooding the downstream, the Ranganedi in Arunachal Pradesh, the Kapili in Assam, and then we have the Doyang in Nagaland, and not to speak of the more than 5 dams which are in Tista in Sikkim and flooding occasionally Sikkim and West Bengal. But irrespective of all these, different ways that floods are being produced, it's important to underline that now the most concerning issue is for our flooding, which is a fundamental factor affecting floods, about which many people may not be aware, is not actually the large amount of flow, is actually the large amount of sediment that is coming. And because of large scale sedimentation, especially after 1950, when we had a 8.6 Richter, one of the largest earthquakes in the world, the whole bed regime of Brahmaputra and their tributaries are alarmingly rising. This figure shows you very clearly how between 1950 and 1990, the bed level of the Brahmaputra at Dibrugarh rose far beyond 3 meters, it's more than 9 feet. And by a latest assessment, the bed has risen almost by 14 to 15 feet. So this is a catastrophic change in the whole configuration of channels. Similarly, not only of the main stream of Brahmaputra, but also of the tributaries. So this is one of the main reasons why there are now frequent flooding, and floods have become more damaging. I leave you with some more images of flooding which show the sheer power of flash floods, which are originated in our neighborhood, mostly in the hills. And some of these floods can have their origin in a different country. For example, we have floods which are triggered in Bhutan affecting us, which triggered in China affecting us, triggered in Arunachal, Meghalaya affecting Assam. So a lot of flash flood creating havoc, and flash floods have become so common, but still it's a matter of worry, and it's unfortunate that our policymakers are not live to the whole need of recognizing the different types of flood, and that is why they're trying to treat all floods in a similar way, like they did in almost all cases, that one size fits all. This is one fundamental flaw in our flood management policy, which is basically because of our inability or our unwillingness to recognize the real ground characteristics, geophysical uniqueness and characteristics of our flooding. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Partha, for a wonderful presentation, especially in terms of what is happening in the Northeast and what is happening with anthropogenic causes, which is the main culprit of floods in the region. And now we have our second speaker, Shailaja Deshpande. Shailaja Deshpande is based at Pune. She is the founder member and currently the director of Jivit Nadi, which is the Living River Foundation. The foundation works on rejuvenation of rivers through public participation and promoting incorporating lifestyles of cleaning the rivers. After a career in interior design, because of her keen interest in the issues of rivers, she has shifted to this area, and she will be talking about the hydrogeological issues around floods, as well as what is the experiences of floods in Pune particularly, and in Maharashtra, part of Maharashtra. And I now welcome Shailaja to present her talk.
Thank you very much, Abraham. And I also thank Water Conflict Forum for giving this opportunity. I will be basically talking about the urban floods and coastal floods to be precisely. And with the case study of Pune, where we are working, we have experienced something on the groundwork, as well as we also have some research associates who have been doing phenomenal research in this category. So flood types in urban, I will broadly categorize them in three types of floods. Fluvial floods, which are river floods due to heavy rainfall, where again, fluvial floods, I will again categorize them in flash floods and overbank floods. Fluvial floods is a recent term which has come because of the surface floods due to the interventions, various interventions which Mr. Partha also spoke about just a few minutes ago. And the third part is the coastal floods. Coastal floods, again, they are because of the waves into the sea, the water level rises, or there are storms or tsunamis. And the subsurface water, it ingresses into the reclaimed land because of the high tides and low tides changes, and water table of the sea is above than the city or the urban settlement. Now, coming back to Pune, we have both the categories, main categories. We also have fluvial floods and we also have fluvial floods, which are urban floods. Except coastal floods, Pune suffers. I mention suffers because that's what is happening because of the urbanization. So we have flash floods, we have overbank floods, and we have fluvial floods due to runoffs and the poor drainage system. Now I'm talking about the flash floods. What exactly happened? If you see the geography and morphology of Pune, Pune is like a saucer, which in earlier seminar about Jammu Kashmir, they mentioned about the saucer shape of Jammu Kashmir. Pune also has a saucer shape, and on the west of Pune, we have Western Ghats, and there are other mountains and hillocks all along Pune, and they have only one outlet, which is Mula Mutha River, which goes away, which goes out of the city. Now, after the dams, we also have 6 sub-watersheds. Now, these 6 sub-watersheds have their stream network or the mini watershed networks. And if you see on the table above, we have seen almost more than 25% of the first, second, third order streams have been vanished, diverted, or below some construction, which causes the flash floods. Now, if you see the third diagram below in the right corner, I am going to categorize Pune city into 4 zones. The brown color which shows here as per my arrow is the scar zone, which is on the mountain top. The green zone, this is the spur zone. Then the light purple which you see is the pediment zone. And the blue color which is there is the river bank zone, which is all along the river. Now, when you see the sub watersheds here, for last couple of years, we have been receiving flash floods in Ram Nadi, Bhairoba stream network and Ambil stream network, which is more than 40%. And the center figure shows you the dots of the flash floods, which indicates that most of the flash floods are occurring into the pediment zone because of the runoff, the fast runoff from the flash floods due to the heavy rainfall into the mountain or into the crest region, and the water does not have a way to reach the river, and this area is getting flooded, which ideally should not be getting flooded. Flash floods, for that in first 2 seminars they have mentioned, so I will just quickly explain that we need to increase infiltration by having a green cover, close canopy cover along the streams, and we have to reduce the runoffs. For there is another third category which has not been looked into carefully by many areas, is the groundwater recharge, which we are fortunate to have a research organization like Aquadam, who has been done a lot of research around the ground recharge network. Technically, now there are managed aquifer recharge. Now you see on this side is my sub watershed map, and on the right hand side you see the aquifer recharge, natural recharge areas in the blue colors, but you can have recharge areas in these watersheds. We have tried to overlap the sub watershed with the aquifer recharged areas. So if these recharges happen, the runoffs are going to be reduced. Now, another type of fluvial flood which Pune receives is because of the overbank flood, because we have 3 main rivers and we have more than 6 dams in the periphery of from 7 kilometers to 35 kilometers away. And suppose there is a heavy rainfall into all catchment areas, every dam is going to release water, and there is only one outlet, which is Muramutta River. So the only way is to give room for the river, absorb the floods along the floodplains with the green zones, and series of wetlands could be one way to control them. And pluvial floods. Now, pluvial floods, we have very bad drainage systems. Urban drainage system is very bad here. And the runoffs which are coming from, as I said, from the sub watersheds need to be tapered down, slow down their velocity, and have some measures to be done. Otherwise, we will end up having these continued pluvious or the surface floods in Pune city. Now, recently, Water Source Department has introduced another line other than the flood lines, which are red and blue. We already have flood lines demarcated into our city, but they are very, very extremely heavily encroached flood lines. Lot of constructions have happened into the flood lines. now they have introduced a yellow flood line, which mentions about, it gives you a caution that this area was indented. So this is the third type which I'm going to talk about, the coastal floods. Now the coastal floods, there are many now researchers which are saying that most of the Indian coast are going to be submerged because the sea is going to increase due to the geological phenomena which has been happening all over the world. It could be part of the natural geological phenomena and aggravated due to climate change. Now the researchers are there for decide about that. But Netherlands has come out with a very good solution on this. They are already below the sea level, where they are taken a concept of accept the water. If sea level is going to increase, why can't we accept the water? So the cities have created the waterways along the railway line, along the public places, along the institutional buildings, where they can absorb the water whichever is coming as an ingress. River discharges and groundwater rise, I'll just mention about this. Here, a lot of sedimentation or erosion happens where there could be ecological restoration techniques like bank stabilization, or having different techniques with the, we have wonderful weeds now about the grasses. There are weeds which hold the sand tightly. So these things could be introduced into the coastal flooding if there is a erosion or sedimentation happening. Finally, the room for the river concept, according to me, if we have to introduce, every river is different, every flow is different, and every flood is different. So we need to define as per customized areas, their geomorphological features, their rainfall patterns, and all other things. We have to define urban rivers, rural rivers, and reviving the river regulation policy. Formation of river monitoring and hazard mitigation committee with help of NGOs, economists, and other experts for flood risk assessment. Administrative zones to correlate with the river zoning. And the reservation should be done accordingly. Introduction and multiple options for water sensitive designs for urban and rural, and as well as peri-urban areas based on climate, geography, and ecosystems. Restoration of mines, because this was mentioned in about Mahanadi river, where upstream there are a lot of mining, illegal mining activities happening, and Mahanadi gets a lot of sediments due to that. So restoration of mines becomes more important in this category. Protecting of the shallow aquifer systems, land use changes, and urban planning must correlate with geography, geology, rainfall pattern, and stream network of that area. This I have tried to compile in very short period about the urban flooding systems and coastal flooding. Here I will stop, and whatever questions I will take it later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shailaja, for giving us a very detailed information about the causes of floods in Pune, which is basically a kind of what the previous webinar we heard about from Kashmir, the kind of situation which was described about Srinagar. And now we have the third speaker in our panel, Ravi, SP Ravi from Kerala. Kerala was in the news during the last 2 years and this year also for the flood it was experiencing. And it was an unprecedented flood which happened, as people narrate, after 100 years. And there were a lot of loss to life and properties. Ravi is an activist, ecologist who is associated with Chalakudi Pura Samrakshana Samiti, which means the river protection of Chalakudi, a civil society organization located in Thrissur. He is also he also looks after the forum's work in Kerala, and Ravi is involved in various environmental issues in Kerala with more focus on water and rivers and also on electricity issues. Occasionally, he writes in Malayalam newspapers and periodicals. He was part of successful movement against Adirapalli hydro project, which recently is again getting to revive by the left front government, and there is a lot of protest which is going on against it. And now I invite Ravi to talk about the experiences of the floods in Kerala.
Thank you, Abraham, and good afternoon to all. We are now looking into flood as one of the major challenges, as this year we have been experiencing flood for the last 3 months in various places of India. So I do a lot of insights into floods as well as flood management. I'll quickly move through the Kerala floods. The monsoon floods, as you know, are not very uncommon in west flowing rivers, especially in the southern Western Ghats, which receive very high rainfall. And Kerala also, because out of the 44 small but vibrant rivers that Kerala has got, 41 are west flowing and 3 are tributaries of Kaveri. So many of these rivers generally do get regular floods during monsoons. But since the 2018 floods, the floods have changed its characteristics, and people are more fearful about flood now. Whereas earlier, it was almost a common phenomenon. Now, whenever the river is likely to breach, people are so much worried that it's becoming even like a fear psychosis also. Now, with regards to the types of floods in Kerala, the most important is obviously the riverine floods. And for riverine floods also, we'll have to look into different characteristics of the same with highlands. The flooding is comparatively less. The midland and lowland areas are more prone to heavy flooding. And the Kutanad region is mainly in Alleppey district. It is surrounded by the Vembanad wetland, which actually receives water from 6 rivers in the central Kerala. And this region is sub sea level region, and the floods in Kutanad region is entirely different from what is being experienced in other parts. And Kochi is experiencing increasing urban floods nowadays also. Now the hilly regions in the state get comparatively less floods due to the topographic peculiarities, because the water flows down quickly due to the slopes, and also the catchment area is comparatively less. But in recent times, the increasing landslides are resulting a lot of flash floods in the hilly regions also. In 2018 alone, it is said that there were nearly 5,000 landslides, both small and including smaller ones. Undammed midland stretches generally witness steady rise in floodwaters depending on the rainfall intensity. Whereas in the dammed rivers, if there is heavy discharge from dams, obviously there is huge water surge. And that had happened in 2018 also. The floodwater retention period in the Midlands, when we move into coastal regions, the water outflow into the sea actually defines the period of tidal action, as well as the water intake into the sea is lesser on some specific days in lunar calendar, which the people in that region have knowledge about. So these floods actually have to be treated differently. Separate regions have to be treated differently when we look into flood management. Unfortunately, that's not happening at present. Now, with respect to the 2018 floods, floods in this
Sorry, we
millennia
cannot
also.
hear you. Can you?
But, yeah.
Can you maybe switch off your video? There may be a bandwidth issue. We cannot hear you clearly.
Okay. Okay.
Okay, Ravi.
Yeah. Am I audible now clearly?
Yes.
Okay, thank
Yes,
you.
much better.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
Even earlier also Kerala used to get occasional huge floods. In fact, the 1341 flood is said to have significantly altered the river course of many major rivers. Then there were floods in 20th century also, the 1924 century flood being the most important. And in 19 why the 2018 floods is different is that the multiple factors that have played into this 2018 floods. One of the most important thing is that the river characteristics have changed and the upper catchments have changed so much. So that is one of the major reasons. I think I'll just there's just some images. I think these are very familiar. The top one is in the Pamba Basin. The bottom left is on the rescue by fishermen, which has been acclaimed a lot internationally. And factors were obviously the most important factor was the extreme precipitation. I'll not be discussing on that, but land use changes in Western Ghats as well as in downstream areas have contributed greatly to this flood, and there were issues with dams operation also. Now, going into the Western Ghats, the Western Ghats ecology expert panel report, that is the Gadgil committee report, clearly states that only 7% of natural ecosystem remains in the Western Ghats. With regards to Kerala, in fact, bulk of the forest cover in the upper catchments of these river basins have been lost over the last couple of centuries. And mainly between 1940 and 19. One of the major factors that can have lasting impacts after the 2018 floods is the increase in rate of flow through soil pipes, as Dr. C.G. Madhusudanan is suggesting. Then the Western Ghats are now dotted with numerous rock quarries. In fact, there are more than 5,900 quarries in the Western Ghats, and that, along with infrastructure development, are actually triggering these huge landslides and related flash floods. Loss of paddy fields is also a major cause. In fact, the state, which had 8.75 lakh hectares of paddy field in 1978, now has less than 2 lakh hectares only. And that actually results in the precipitation in the midland areas to reach the rivers very quickly. In fact, most of these were retained by these paddy fields and wetlands, but that's not happening now. I'll skip this one. Now, I'm moving to dams issue. most of the smaller dams were full even before the middle of July in 2018, and even the larger dams were getting filled very quickly. Unfortunately, the dam authorities chose to keep the dams full or near to FRL without providing for flood cushion. I'll just briefly show some figures for the scenario if there was a flood cushion of 25%. I took this 25% figure because the CWC report that came just after the floods was suggesting that even with 25% flood cushion, the flood could not have been avoided. But that's not the picture actually. Look into the major reservoirs. The Idukki reservoir should have had 365 million cubic meters of flood cushion if it had 25%, whereas actually the 3-day inflow was 435 and the probable outflow could have been only 40. This is 40 because 30 million cubic meters goes through the powerhouse into a different basin. At Idamalayar and Kaki, actually the discharge from dam was more than the inflow, whereas the entire inflow could have been contained if there was sufficient flood cushion. And in Chalakudi Basin also, bulk of the inflow into the 3 upstream reservoirs of upstream of Peringalkuttu, those could have retained at least 70% of the flow, and the maximum floodwater height would have been less by at least 2 meters in both Periyar and Chalakudi basins. Now, with regards to the 2019,
Ravi, just a minute. Can you wrap it?
Yeah, sure.
In a couple of minutes. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, continue.
With regards to the important aspects were huge landslides at Kavalapara in Nilambur and Putumala in Malappuram, and at various other places also. And at Kavalapara, in fact, 57% lost life. In 2020 also, the Pettimudi landslide has resulted in loss of life for 71 plantation workers. But the most important aspect of 2019 floods was with the very deep cumulonimbus clouds seen on the night of August 18, which, according to climate scientist Dr. Abhilash, was totally uncharacteristic of Kerala monsoons. And this year, what we are seeing is the wettest September. And obviously, these are suggesting that the rains are changing and we need, I'm concluding with this. In fact, a lot of studies have to go into the recent floods, and remedial measures have to come. In fact, there are no river basin level flood management plans in Kerala, and reservoir management has to improve much more. And there are no integrated reservoir management plans for various dams. And most importantly, eco-restoration of Western Ghats is going to be the key to Kerala survival. Thank you.
Thank you, Ravi,
Yeah.
for a very detailed and wonderful presentation about what has happened in Kerala for the past 3 years, as well as going into the anthropogenic causes, which dates back to several decades of land use stages. Now we have for today's the last presentation by Eklavya Prasad. Eklavya is involved in the flood issues in Bihar for many years. He heads the organization called Megh Pain Abhiyan, that means Cloud Water Campaign. His innovations in water sector, especially on sanitation, on drinking water issues, are being highlighted even by the ministry recently. Through his camera, he has able to capture the uniqueness in North Bihar region and has also built a portfolio of the same. Besides an activist, a practitioner, he is also a person who has given an audiovisual narration about what is happening in Bihar with floods. And now invite Eglevia to give his presentation regarding the Bihar.
Thank you, Abraham. I hope I am audible.
Yes, yes, you are.
Okay. Good afternoon to all. My presentation actually is going to focus on the whole issue of floods not being the same in Bihar. I start off from this pretext that it is not the same. And if you see this artwork, so to say, in a way, it seems to be similar. It seems to be same, despite having so many layers of differences. And this is exactly how I would define what is happening in Bihar. The normal photographs that we come across is of these kinds, whether, and though these photographs are for last over 12 years, but this is what we tend to see during the flood season. And this is a kind of an image that goes on, that anything that is inundated, that is the way is flowing water, that is what floods is. And we kind of create a homogeneous understanding or a picture about floods. There are others as well. So these are the different kinds of narratives, photo narratives that we tend to come across while we are during the flood season. So there are plenty. I mean, there are various types of inundation that we normally see during this period. In actual, these photographs, if you go into the details of it, they are depicting a different kind of floods that exists in Bihar. So the first photograph that I showed is actually of a riverine flood. And these are basically between the embankments of the same river system. The second one is a riverine flood, and the water that you're seeing should not have been there because of the fact that this is on the countryside, meaning the areas that are outside the embankments. And this was the breach in 2007 when the entire water was flowing out of in Khagaria district. The third is actually the waterlogged region. I mean, these tend to get waterlogged depending upon it. The intensity and the period of inundation differs across. There are areas which are inundated throughout the year. There are areas which are inundated for specific period of in a particular year. The fourth photograph is actually of, and this is something which is very different in Bihar, which we have seen. And this is actually floods in an area which is actually outside the embankments of two river systems. So when we talk about floods, similarly, I have given the details of, when we talk about floods, and when these photographs come in, and when we start talking about what needs to be done, how it needs to be done, it somehow has a flavor of it being uniform, and that is what needs to be demolished, needs to be replaced by a very strong narrative that floods are not the same. So let us not look at flood mitigation, preparedness, minimizing of flood impacts, etc., from a very uniform perspective. Now, why is it important for us to look into the typologies of floods? Basically, and what are the factors that we actually need to look into when we are talking about this particular flood being different by compared to the other floods? One is in terms of the location, the category of rivers. I mean, it is not that all rivers are the same. In Bihar, we have these large river systems, and then we have these tributaries to those river systems, and then we have the distributaries to those river systems. In 2017, the distributaries in Paschim Champaran, in most of the Indo-Nepal districts bordering the Indo-Nepal border, they had floods primarily because there was a cloudburst in the Tarai region. So there are different kinds of river. We have to understand, we have to recognize that there are different rivers that we need to factor in when we are looking at floods as a whole. Also, in terms of floods as a character of floods, it's different. We cannot say that all floods are the same in terms of because of the fact that it inundates land, people are displaced. No, there are different types of floods which displaces people differently, impacts people differently. Have we got into the whole issue of hazards? How are the kind of people being exposed to these floods? I mean, these are the areas that we need to factor in when we are talking about why floods are not the same in a state like Bihar. So what I've done in my presentation is I'm basically I have taken a few examples to prove to you all that how floods impact people differently. And it is from a very a micro study that we had done way back in 2016, where we are trying to look at how floods actually moderate floods impact people. Now, for example, this Chegara river in Paschim Champaran, you won't even be able to see this river during the summer period, but then it starts flowing during monsoon if there are floods and if there are rains upstream. Now, look at the intensity of floods and the period of flash floods that have occurred in this particular in the river Harkatwa, in the village Harkatwa. So the point here, what I'm trying to bring forth is that by just looking at the inundation, it is not going to help us, because of the fact that we need to figure out as to what has been the frequency of flash floods in a particular area. What are the months in which the people in that area or that region tends to experience flash floods? Then only we would be able to talk about what exactly needs to go in those villages. For example, you talk about another village, another river called Pandai, and the village being Mangraha. Now, when you look at how people try to prepare themselves for floods, what are the challenges post floods, and what are their requirements, and then you try to overlay it with the months in which they can tend to experience flash floods, do people actually have this kind of separation in terms of preparation during floods, challenges post floods? Because they just don't know when the floods are. It's not like seasonal feature that, it's only from June to September that they'll have floods. It happens starting from January. They had floods in March, April, May. So the point here is that unless and until we get into the nuances of these floods, it is very difficult to come up with any kind of intervention. So flash floods, actually in Bihar, we started hearing about flash floods in 2017, when the area, as I mentioned earlier, that those areas were affected primarily because of the rains in the Tarai region. But flash floods have been occurring since eons. And we have data of how the flash floods have affected people from 2006 to 2016. Now, and once we have identified flash flood as a potential threat, it is important for us also to then strategize our interventions likewise. By just acknowledging and respecting that doesn't help in solving or minimizing the issues that are there and which are being confronted by people. This is the river area that I was talking when I mentioned about a unique typology where the area, the region is between, is outside the embankments of two river systems. So if you see this slide, on the right hand side is the Kosi, and on the left is the embankment of Kamla Balan. Now this area has changed in terms of, it's very difficult to say whether it's flooding, whether it's inundation, whether it's permanent waterlogging, and also the fact that certain interventions have led to a change in the character of floods in this area. And areas which were earlier inundated for 6 months, now they remain inundated for almost 8 to 9 months. Now, if we are not able to identify an area like this or a region like this which is confronting the problem, yes, I'll get over in another 2 minutes. So unless and until we identify these areas, we recognize these areas and talk about, yes, the interventions again have to be different. There is no point in having plans about disaster preparedness and management which are again general. Again, in another village in the same region, now you can look at as to what kind of expenses are these people, experiencing over the years, whether it's in terms of the additional expenditure in terms of the housing, or in terms of even the temporary housing when they are displaced. Now, these factors will not be considered unless and until we get into the nuances, unless and until we recognize this particular flood as a typology and as a problem which is unique to that region. If I try to solve the problem of this particular area from a perspective of, say, a riverine flood, it's not going to help us at all. And that's precisely what has been happening. That, you know, the problems are something else. The interventions that are being planned are more on a generic manner. And that is the reason why we have innumerable examples of why certain services have failed in the flood-prone areas of North Bihar. So it is not that what we are promoting as typologies is something new. It is not. The government has acknowledged it. The Bihar State Disaster Management Authority, they have this on their website saying that these are the four different kinds of floods or typologies of floods. But if it is so, why is it so that we are not responding according to the typologies? That is a big question. So I'll end up my slide by saying that we will continue to advocate for a typology-based flood discourse, policies, and practices, because if you do not, there are other related issues which we need to address. Otherwise, it'll be just a kind of recognizing a problem and on the other hand, not doing nothing about it. Thank you. Hello.
Can Abraham or Janak unmute themselves, please?
Yes, I thought Abraham is going to. Abraham, are you there?
Yes, he's there. Abraham?
I'm just, yes. Thank you, Eglevia. We had wonderful presentation from all the speakers. We will be coming back to them with questions. We have got several questions from the participants. And before we getting into that, I would like to just briefly, for a couple of minutes, I would like to summarize what the talk was. While the last webinar provided us with lived, real-time and phenomenological aspects of living with flood, today's presentation provided us an understanding within the scientific rationality, the reasons behind the flood, the categorization of flood, creating typologies or what we could say as taxonomies of flood, so that its causes and effects can be better understood. We have also got a wide array of flood typologies through the speakers, the causes, the trigger that creates a specific type of flood and its manifestation. These include hydromorphological causes, land use and its impact, the geological aspect, and above all flood happening as a natural phenomena, and also the anthropogenic causes that creates innumerable hardships in the form of flood. At the same time, while we are doing this kind of scientific rationalization, we should not forget that floods have an archetype. It has myths associated with it. It has a universal meaning when one is experiencing flood. It has a cleansing as well as a regeneration metaphor behind it. If we look into the myths around the world, whether it is India, the primordial man which is being saved by the first incarnation of Vishnu, or the Noah's Ark from the biblical concept, or what we have, the Sumerian myth of Gilgamesh, everywhere there is an element of what we call the flood coming, the flood cleansing the universe, and the flood regenerating the universe. With that, I would like to conclude myself, and I request my co-moderator Janak to give in a couple of minutes his views on the presentation. Then we move into what the question answer session. Thank you.
Thank you, Abraham. Actually, you know, with fantastic sort of presentations today on all floods are not same, we really opened up a huge sort of a platform for policymakers to understand what the floods are all about, starting from the Himalayan floods to the plain floods and floods due to the embankment, breaking embankments and breaches in the rivers, and also due to the low-lying area getting inundated, and also distinctly different from, for instance, what Ravi has presented, from the Western Ghats floods to, and then the urban flood. I mean, there's a huge variation in the floods. So you really have to understand what these floods are before really embarking on in the policy interventions. Therefore, I think this is a sort of a webinar which is really going to be a sort of a eye-opener for the policymakers and for the government officials and the whole executive to really look at it very seriously. And I hope it really helps all the subsequent policy interventions, because at the moment, flood is considered as a layman's concept is water inundation or a water stagnation, and all floods are treated alike. So that is a myth we have demystified, and hope it really helps. I think we should now go for question answers.
Thank you. We have got a number of questions, and I think on the basis of the speaker's order, I think that is better way to coordinate the question. We will be asking 2 specific questions to each speaker, and then there will be some generic questions which any of them can answer. And within the given time of around 25 minutes, let us, and those which are remaining, we will be glad to answer it in a later stage while we are providing the link to the workshop. Partha, are you ready? Hello? Hello? Am I audible?
Yeah,
Yes,
yeah.
you are audible. You are audible. Yeah.
Partha, are you ready? There are 2 questions which you have seen the questions in the question answer.
I have seen the questions, and I have also briefly already answered, very briefly, but I can repeat.
Okay.
But if there is anything left, I can address.
Yeah, there is one specific question by Sen Rainman. Dr. Partha, could you the way forward to cope with different typologies of flood? Would it have to work with the principle of living with the floods? It's a very interesting question, because can we how we can cope with the flood?
No, I have already briefly answered that, but let me repeat actually. Yes, we can cope, and there was a time when our indigenous communities successfully used to cope with all these different types of flood, even with flash floods, which for modern flood managers, it's very, very difficult to manage. And they used to be very cope very well, even with flash floods. But with time and with different kind of environmental drivers and climatic drivers acting on the whole geoecological system, the whole nature of rainfall and flooding has changed. Therefore, the traditional knowledge based on which those coping mechanisms or those coping strategies were developed are no longer working effectively. That is why indigenous coping practices are now less successful or less effective than before. But but many of them are still coping well. So therefore, it is up to the flood managers and policymakers to complement or supplement the indigenous practices of our region with eco-friendly and technologically benign kind of strategies which should help them further to cope well. But to be able to suggest or recommend or implement good coping strategies from policymakers' point of view, they must have a very nuanced understanding of very different typologies of flooding, and there are very different consequences and very different processes through which a flood propagates from mountain to the valleys to the floodplain, right? And to the sea. And the argument that we have been making again and again in this session is that right now that understanding is not there. Therefore, that has to be taken care of. But it is possible because there are other examples from other countries. Even in South Asia, there are countries where a lot of good practices have been introduced even by governments. I think.
Okay, Partha. I would ask you the second question, which is by Mr. Prabhagar Dagre. Northeastern states like Assam are affected by floods almost every year. To what degree is China responsible, considering the destruction they cause in the Himalayan region? There are many questions like that, but nowadays China is the hot topic. That way, maybe, yeah.
No, I was actually interested in replying to this question. See, it's not possible that, and it is not true that China is responsible for each and every flood that we suffer from. But although it has become a tendency for many of our politicians in northeastern states like Arunachal and Assam to blame China and also to blame our rivers just to escape from the responsibility that they have been given to manage floods and manage rivers, which they couldn't, and just to cover up their failure of dealing with floods. Another country is being blamed all the time. But yes, there are certain occasions when there were flooding triggered in China and all that. As I gave one example, and that was a kind of watershed in the Riparian bilateral relation between China and India. From that flood event that happened in 2000 onwards, a lot of discussion started between China and India, and finally the outcome is that now India is getting regularly India is getting hydrological data, which is from China, although in a limited way, and they are actually purchasing it, buying it, but nevertheless it is available, which is helping India to develop good flood forecast and flood warning. So that proposition is actually not true.
Yeah, okay. Now two questions to Shailaja. Shailaja, are you? Hello?
Yes, I'm. Yeah.
Shailaja, one is from Professor Kanchan Chopra.
Yeah.
She has asked a very interesting question. How would you combine urbanization with the suggestion to leave room for river? How to avoid increasing construction? And how these two things can coexist? That is what the question is. Like the urbanization is anyway going to happen. And how can the rivers also be saved while we have some kind of a responsible urbanization?
Correct. Now, I will simplify this answer in a very simple way. When we plan for a city, do we plan for the road traffic or the traffic of that area, how much it is going to be? If the roads are going to be heavily traffic, then we widen the roads, we acquire the space for whatever the reason. Isn't it the same way? If the floods are going to be affecting us, the urbans need to plan well to keep the space for the rivers to flow, and they need to flood. So they have been there before the civilization. Means if you see the rivers of Western Ghats, they are more than 1 to 1.5 crores of years ago. They have been born there. So they have created their own system and we have intervened them. Urbanization should not be hindering them, but it should be live and let live.
Okay.
Thank you.
There is another question by Nagmani Rao.
Yes.
Mumbai has been facing serious and frequent flooding during the past few years or even before.
Yes.
Given the current way it is designed,
yeah,
how can changes be brought in urban planning to minimize the problems? Similarly, Pune faces regular evictions in Nadi Kinare Vastis, which all of us who live in Pune know.
Yes,
when there is water released from the dams, how can this be avoided?
See, again,
you got the question.
First question about the coastal flooding. I'm not an urban planner, but there have been examples outside India where they have utilized the public spaces, public gardens into creating, bioswales where the water can be accommodated. If Mumbai has railway lines and if they can create the channels all along the railway lines every year, smallest rainfall and the Mumbai railways are stopped. So could we start doing something which have been there, create the waterways in such a way, even in the public gardens where the localized water can get accommodated, and fortunately it has a sea. So as per the high tide and low tide, when the low tide happens, the water is going back to the sea. All you need to do is accommodate the water there locally. So if the urban planners can start doing some designing, and there are examples like Netherlands very effectively doing this water issues of managing the waters of coastal areas. Coming back to the Pune has, as I said, typically a very complex issue of flash floods and river floods. It is not just the dams which is flooding, it is a poor urban planning of Pune city. Pune has sprawled. It has not been managed properly along with its whatever the resources. They should have taken the advantage of the hills, with creating more close canopy forests along the streams and having natural resources planned in such a way you leave the spaces and also can have an urban settlement. So the poor planning of drainage, structured and non-structured, because unstructured, which are the natural streams and tributaries, need to have their own spaces. You leave that space and you can do your construction or any urban planning as such, which has not been done there. And that's why the problem.
There is another question. I think after finishing the other two speakers, we will come back to you.
Yes.
Somebody wanted to know about the history of floods in Pune.
Okay.
Maybe because there is not much of a kind of imageries of Pune's flood coming in the media, maybe because of that.
No, but history of floods, I will just quickly answer. History of floods, at least there is a history till the Peshwa period where Ambil stream and Mutha river used to flood severely. So history of floods, if you see in historical evidences in Pune, you can see the flooding pattern at least for 400 to 500 years ago. And archaeological evidences also show, which I will talk later when, if we get time.
Okay, yeah. And now the questions are to Ravi. Hello? Ravi is, Satida, Ravi is on?
Yes, Ravi, please unmute yourself.
Unmute yourself, yeah, Ravi, please.
Okay.
There is one specific question. There are quite a few questions, but we will take 2-3 important questions. There, somebody is asking, like in 2015, the government of Kerala banned mining in 6 rivers of Kerala for a period of 3 years. Kerala is facing heavy floods for past 2 years. Is there any connection between these two concerning to increase the height of the riverbed? Maybe you got the question?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
In fact, this is a misconcept, and this has been circulating widely in Kerala that sand deposit that had come during the floods are actually causing repeated floods. But that's not true. In fact, the rivers have actually lost all the historic sand deposits since about 1975. And now the water level as well as the river bed level has gone down considerably in most of the rivers. In the case of Chalakudi River, I know that at many places, the bottom of the river has gone down by more than 15 meters. So that is the picture, and at present, there is only very little sand, but there are some issues, especially with regards to debris that had come due to landslides, and that if that is blocking at some places, that has to be cleared. Sand is, per se is not a cause, and also the volume of sand and the volume of water that is coming is totally uncomparable. Even if you remove whatever sand is available, you can actually prevent flood for a few seconds or at most for a few minutes, nothing beyond that.
Yeah, another question is just related to that by Jangi and Daria. That is also about the silt accumulation. Maybe you can answer this together. And then there's another question about why there is a failure. Why there is a failure to implement either Gadgil committee reports or the much watered down Kasturi Rangan committee report. Why there is no political will? What is happening? Finally, there is no need. Finally, is there not a need for a predictive rainfall runoff flood model to be put in place for early warnings of dam management?
With regards to Janki Madam's question, in fact, in the case of major reservoirs like Idukki or Edamalayar, the silt accumulation is actually eating into its storage space, and that can have a small impact on the floods also. But I think the floods are more with respect to dam management and not with silt accumulation. But silt, the accumulated silt is actually reducing the storage, and that's having with regards to the Western Ghat reports, obviously it is a lot of vested interests playing, and most of the politicians are uh, playing in tune with these vested interests, and that actually is affecting the uh, survival of the state itself. And I'm sure that sooner or later we will have to go for eco-restoration of the Western Ghats. Without that, I don't think there is any scope for survival beyond a certain limit.
Okay, thank you, Ravi. And now, Eklavya, there are few questions to you. You must have seen already. You started answering also, it seems, but we will take a couple of them. One question is like one question by Amidangshu. It seems the local communities are asking for river deepening as a flood mitigation strategy. What are his thoughts? What is your thoughts on this? Especially from.
I've already
Achha, you have. Okay, you have already answered. Would you like to say something specifically, because others also can hear to it? Okay.
Yes.
Then there is another question by Rain Zimmerman. Maybe you can answer. There are benefits of flood. Like, for example, fertile land. Gangetic plains is basically a product of flood. Increased fisheries. Then how do you understand this political economic context of flood? You know, that is from Rain Zimmerman.
Yeah, so I have also answered to that query. I mean, that question is answered.
Okay, you don't want to say anything specifically on that?
No, because of the fact that if there are other questions that I have not answered, if those are picked up, then
okay, then you select. Then there is another by Himanshu Kulkarni. That is addressed to both of you, you and Partha. That is basically like, how do you differentiate between the flood between Ganga Basin and Brahmaputra? If there are any such differences, what parts of two basin dominates in terms of flash floods? You know.
Okay, so let me start answering Dr. Kulkarni's question with regard to the flash flood. Basically, in Bihar, the areas that are, or the districts that are affected by flash floods are mostly those that are on the Indo-Nepal border, and they tend to bring in those flash floods. So we are looking at Paschim Champaran, Purbi Champaran, part of Sitamarhi, and then Araria, Kishanganj. So these are the districts that actually are affected by flash floods. As compared to Assam, I think so in Assam, the incidence of flash floods are far more, if I'm not wrong. Partha can correct me. And in Bihar, it is more in terms, the floods are more in terms of, with respect to the embankments and the location from the embankments. So that is one factor that is common as far as the floods is concerned. With regard to the overall differentiation between Ganga floods and Brahmaputra floods, one of the major differences that I can point out that in Brahmaputra, you have, as Partha had mentioned in his presentation, that there are dam-based flooding also, whereas in Bihar, we do not have the dams. So, I mean, barrages are different, but dam-based flooding does not happen. So this is one of the difference that I could.
Okay. Partha, would you like to say something?
One sentence. Now, one line of distinction. That
just one sentence. Yeah.
One line of distinction that one can make is that in case of Bihar, most of the flash floods are of transboundary origin. They origin mainly from Nepal, which is a different country. But in case of Brahmaputra, some of them are definitely triggered by Bhutan and China, but most of them are within the territory of India, but they are mostly interstate in nature. That's one line of difference.
Eklavya, there is another question from Srinivas Badigar. He is from Atri. Questions: management of flood is a techno-institutional challenge, especially in Bihar and elsewhere too. Why isn't there any movement on flood insurance or crop and property loss? The state might have relief and compensation program for loss of livestock and life, but that might barely prevent collapse of livelihood.
I mean, this is one area which actually has remained unattended. Though the government tends to provide compensation post floods, but that is largely for people who are affected during the floods. And then when the compensation comes in, the compensation is actually for the landowner rather than the ones who are tilling it. So there is this whole issue in terms of insurance, which actually has not seen the light of the day. The one area which needs to be further pursued.
There was one first question somebody has asked about embankment and I can't see it now in the question answer box, but that would have been an interesting.
I have briefly answered, and I think Ekalabya also during his presentation has addressed it.
Yeah, and I think that is very relevant for Bihar also, because it was part of Ekalabya's presentation.
Yeah. The crux is that, mainly because of embankments, the countryside of embankment experience a lot of water logging, which is one sees in large scale in Bihar, but in smaller scale in Assam. But the problem is of the same origin. And to ease out the situation, actually, there is a principle that when you make an embankment, for each and every pair of embankment, you have to construct certain drainage structures so that the drainage congestion can be taken care of. But what has happened in case of Assam, I'm sure in Bihar also, more and more embankments were built, but people forgot about making drainage channels. So that's why we can see all low-lying areas are, inundated, and there is no facility to drain the water out of it. And this is the relation between drainage congestion and embankment, because they obstruct all natural waterways. They obstruct the flow of tributaries and other water bodies flow to the main river, and there is water seepage. These are all well known. That's why on both mainly in countryside there is a lot of inundation. Ekalabya can also add.
Abraham,
yes,
there is this question which has been asked to me about how flood-prone districts of Bihar need to create ecosystems around the community.
Yes, I was going to ask that. Why don't you? The community should start their own. So to sustain in flood-prone district. So this is by Rajiv Ranjan.
Right. So the basic thing is here that in order to begin with developing an ecosystem, community-based ecosystem, it is important that we first recognize as to a particular community or a region is in a very different location with different challenges with regard to flood. So again, identifying the community and the location with a particular kind of floods is something important. Secondly, there are a lot of innovations that are happening across North Bihar, whether it's be in terms of drinking water, whether be it's in terms of sanitation, whether be it in terms of agriculture. Now, these islands of excellence needs to be then now taken up by the state, because all these processes happen to be people driven or community driven or even individual household driven. Now, it is a time that we kind of unpack our approach, which kind of is more general rather than get into nuances. And I know it's very difficult to get into nuances when you're talking about scale, but then if the scale has to persist, has to sustain, then we need to get into nuances. So it is important that a community is understood. When we talk about a community, it is not a homogeneous thing. Community in itself is quite heterogeneous. So we need to look into the gender relationship. We need to look into the marginalized sections. We need to look at the power dynamics, and based on that, develop systems that have worked and then take it up to scale.
Okay. There is a general question to everybody, which will be also interesting. How far will interlinking of rivers mitigate the flood problems to some extent? This is a question I think. Who would, anybody can just put their thought into it.
I'll try to answer this partly. Interlinking of rivers is usually.
Shailaja. We have lost the
I think we lost Shailaja now.
Shailaja, country. Monsoon mein every place except few locations there is going to be water everywhere. So when there is going to be less rain, the areas are going to have less rains everywhere. So where the excess water is going to come from? Pune, if I have 6 dams here and we have excess water, but in summer season, we have lack of water, less of water. That is one. Then every river, every is a entity of its sedimentation is different. Ghats, every west flowing river is different than the east flowing river. So when you create, you change the morphology of any structure, you really don't know what you are going to cause the natural disasters in that sense. So this is one of the danger which I feel. Others are free for their perceptions.
Yeah. Another issue is like there is nothing called a surplus basin and a deficit basin as such. Every basin has its own independent characteristics. It may be surplus at certain point of time temporally as well as spatially. Those all issues. Anyone else of you would like to comment on this river
Yeah.
linking issue?
Yes, Abraham.
Yes. Yes. David.
Yeah. In fact, Kerala has got experience in interlinking. That is starting from Mullaperiyar. And the Parambikulam Maliyar project also. In fact, during the 2018 floods, both these had badly affected the state, and they have actually aggravated the floods because with regards to Mullaperiyar as well as the other one also in the Chalakudi Basin, the state has no control over the storage and management of these projects, and the government of Tamil Nadu chose to store more water in these, and at times of floods, huge water release came into downstream, and that compounded the floods very badly. The interlinking has actually compounded the issues. It has become more complex also.
Okay. Okay. There is a last question which we will take up. This is by Rujishree to Eklavya. Eklavya, please help me in making sense of floods around Bhagalpur district of Bihar. What could be the ways to mobilize the local community to have effective flood preparedness?
Abraham, could you just repeat the question again? Sorry, I didn't, I was answering.
Eklavya, please help me in making sense of floods around Bhagalpur district. What could be the ways to mobilize the local community? This we were discussing, like what are the ways to mobilize the local community based on your experiences to have effective flood preparedness?
I mean, I would, going by the way I learned about floods, or I'm still learning about floods, is following the narratives that are dominant in a particular district, based on the historical narratives that are present there, or in terms of the news that comes in, that kind of indicates as to what are the major, sorry, there is a power failure at my end. Okay, so basically, the way to approach this is to understand the entire water systems of that particular district. That is the way to begin. And once you start doing it, once you start going into the details of it, naturally you will come across people who have been working, who have been raising issues, or who have been working on certain aspects of the entire water scenario of that particular district. So, and also the fact that while working with the community, it is better to explore newer ways rather than to just follow what is being done earlier, because each area is different. Each area has its own ways to respond, to comprehend, to analyze. So I think so. The beginning should be with Ruchi herself, trying to understand the area and then pursuing it with local people.
Okay. I think we are now running about
Abraham,
the time. And yes.
Abraham,
yes.
Can you give me just 1 minute?
Yes. Yeah, 1 minute. We can go up to.
I think Sarita has pointed out, and I also saw there was an important question put to all of us. That question the person who put the question said that nobody is actually talking about solutions in this discussion. So we need to clarify that, you know, each of the session of this webinar series has been designed with a particular purpose. And this is why, you know, we have more concentrated on discussing and, you know, in a threadbare discussion, explanation and justification about the typologies of flood. And we are trying to, you know, make a strong point that, you know, it's right now it's very, very important to have a good understanding of the geophysical or ecohydrological nature in the context of local characteristics. The fifth of this webinar series is particularly designed to address the solutions, and it is called the way forward. So the person who has put this question, we request him to attend the fifth seminar, because even if it's not that we are actually escaping from that question, but this is it will not be possible within the given time, because our focus was something else in this seminar. Thank you.
Thank you, Partha. I think now we are 5-6 minutes ahead of our prescribed 5:30. And now I request Dr. Janak to come and wind up today's episode. Dr. Janak, you are there?
I am there.
Yeah. Why don't you just wind it up and then we can
thank you, Abraham.
Yeah.
Actually, before winding up, it is important for us to really, you know, bring about, you know, the key issues that you know, have come about, you know, for our understanding in the context of all floods are not the same. The most important point that I see as a critical issue, particularly from the perspective of the policy makers, is that, look, flood is not a static concept; it's a flow concept. All inundation should not be considered as a flood, and that is the reason why, in fact, Manoj Mishra ji in his first presentation, he said you have to demystify the flood. And so that is one thing we need to understand. That is also very important in the context of the urban flood. You see inundation, stagnation everywhere. That's not a flood. Flood should be seen only in the context of the river overflowing. It's a flood plains, and that in that sense it is a flood, the flow concept, number one. Number two, it is also very important for us to understand in the overall context of the disruption in the hydrological cycle. See, we have talked lots about the flash floods during today's webinar, and these flash floods occur mainly because of the disruptions in the hydrological cycle. The hydrological cycles are not smooth as it used to be, say 50 years ago, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. So quite a lot of hydrological, the disruptions in the hydrological cycle, for various reasons. One of the most important reasons that could be attached to it is the global warming induced climate change. That is number two. Number three, the land use changes, particularly, you know, and the anthropogenic interventions in the upstream of the rivers, particularly the Western Ghats, is a critically very, very important. That is, in fact, contributing a hell of a lot to the particularly the flash floods. And the most important point that I would like to point out here is the mindless management of the dams, which Ravi was talking about. That's very important, because India is the country of dams. I mean, I don't know how many dams, there's so many dams exist, but very badly managed. There is no impact analysis. You construct a dam, forget about it, forget about the siltation that is accumulated, forget about the impact analysis of the dam. If it overflows, but it badly managed, that contributes to flood. That's precisely what the flood was about in Kerala in 2018, Idiki Dam. And finally, in fact, Abraham talked about the ILR. Whether ILR can reduce the flood fury. My answer to that is, it can never reduce the fury of the flood, because imagine Ganges flooding and the Brahmaputra flooding. If you want to really reduce the impact of the flood in the downstream, you have to have at least half of the river of the width of elsewhere, like a canal. If the Brahmaputra is 3 kilometers wide, you have to have at least 1.5 kilometers wide river elsewhere to divert the flood. Can you do that? Not even 5 to 10% of the flood water can be diverted through your ILR. So it's a myth. It's an absolute myth that you can really reduce the fury of the flood by ILR. I think these are some of the very important issues that I think I should really thank all the panelists for excellent fantastic presentations and very meaningful questions from the audience. And I would like to also put on record my sincere thanks to Sneha and Sarita for their wonderful effort in organizing this webinar. I thanks everybody. So with great pleasure, with lots of questions and with a lot of issues and concerns on the platter for the policymakers, I think it's time for us to close the webinar. Thanks everybody.
Thank you everyone. Thanks.
Thank you.
Hi, Abraham, Janak, good